Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's 5x15 event, bringing together 5 thinkers and storytellers who will each speak for around 15 minutes about their life and their work. We have an absolutely stellar lineup this evening, and we're very excited to get started. Remember that all of our speakers' books will be on sale this evening from the wonderful Newham Bookshop, our independent bookselling partner, and details about how to order those will be posted in the chat shortly. Without any further ado, let me welcome our first speaker, the biographer Adam Sisman, who is the author of Boswell's Presumptuous Task, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, and a biographer of A.J.P. Taylor, Hugh Trevor Roper, and John le Carré, who he'll be telling us about this evening. Adam, welcome.
Hello, I can't start my video. Yes, I have. Good. Am I up? Yes?
Yes, you're up.
Good. I've spent the past 30 years or so writing biographies of other people, and tonight I want to turn the lens at least halfway around and talk about my own life with one of my subjects, the spy writer John le Carré. It can be a strange thing to meet and get to know one of your favorite authors. After all, you've already spent quite a long time, many hours with him or with her, or so it seems. As you read, you can hear their voices echoing in your head, especially if they have a very distinctive voice, if that writer has a very distinctive voice, as John le Carré had. In my case, I had been reading John le Carré for, I don't know, almost 4 decades when we met. Some of the novels I'd read several times over. I first encountered John le Carré on my parents' bookshelves when I was a teenager. I still have copies of his first two novels that I read then in their battered, in their pale green penguin crime covers, now rather battered, but still more or less intact. And of course, I read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the bestseller that propelled him to stardom. In the 1970s, I devoured le Carré's Quest for Carla trilogy, originally envisaged, as I would later discover, as a much longer sequence. And like everybody else alive at the time, I watched Alec Guinness portraying George Smiley in the 2 classic BBC TV adaptations, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in 1979 and Smiley's People in 1982. At some point, I discovered that John le Carré was a pen name for somebody called David Cornwell. By the early 1980s, I was married and living in North London. My wife and I enjoyed walking on Hampstead Heath, and there we would sometimes be able to identify locations which le Carré had used in his novels. At weekends, on several occasions, we walked across the Heath to a pub for lunch called the Wells Tavern, and something like 30 years later, that was the same pub where I would often go with David Cornwell. My involvement with David started in the most straightforward possible way. I wrote him a letter proposing myself as his biographer, and he replied, suggesting that I come and see him at his house in Hampstead to discuss the suggestion. This was in the summer of 2010. David was welcoming and introduced me to his wife, his second wife, Jane, to whom he'd then been married for half a lifetime. He made it clear that he wanted me to write without restraints, as he put it, which was what I wanted too. I estimated that it would take me 4 years to write, which in fact it proved to be accurate. In his reply to my initial letter, David had highlighted 2 biographical problems. One was his habitual reluctance to discuss his very spectacular, let me start that again. I'm going to read what he said. My very limited and unspectacular career in intelligence. And the other was what he called my own messy personal life. I was able to overcome the first problem, at least to my own satisfaction. Though David remained silent on his time with MI5 and MI6, I heard about it nonetheless. If I could not provide all the details, I was able to trace his career in espionage and to show how, when, and where he worked throughout. Over the next few years, I had more than half a dozen day-long sessions with David, in which I was able to interrogate him in detail about his past. These amounted to perhaps 50 or 60 hours in total. The normal pattern was for me to arrive at his house in North London at about 11 in the morning, and we'd talk for a couple of hours and then head off for lunch. Afterwards, we'd return to his house and continue talking until the early evening, with often, well, in fact, invariably, a fortifying drink in the late afternoon. I very much enjoyed his company at first, which was, his company was always stimulating and often fun. And I sometimes had to remind myself that we weren't really friends. I did, however, find that I was disappointed by what he had to say. Much of what he told me consisted of generalities or stories with which I was already familiar, some of which I suspected to be exaggerated or even fabricated. Only now does it occur to me that David may have failed to understand the function of these sessions. For me, they were a guide to further investigations and a source of anecdotal detail. For him, as later became apparent, they were a form of dictation. When eventually he was able to read what I had written, he seemed surprised that I had not taken down what he had said verbatim. As well as visiting David in London, I made several trips to his house in Cornwall, where I would work in his archive and take my meals with David and Jane when they were there too. Though his records were chaotic and far from complete, I found there the factual foundation on which to build my biography. David gave me introductions to current and former friends, some now enemies, former colleagues, and members of his own family. One contact led to another. On the Essex shoreline, I crunched along the shingle. In Southern California, I strolled along a dusty track into the scrub. In a single month, I flew to Germany 4 times, each time returning that same day. I began to feel like George Smiley, patiently reconstructing the past from fragmentary detail. I became aware that some of my interviewees were reporting back to David on what had been said. From time to time, I would receive a chatty letter from him, often with greetings of some kind and news of what had been happening in his world. Both the letters themselves and the envelopes were almost always handwritten, suggesting to me, at any rate, that nobody else knew what he had written, or perhaps even that he had written to me at all. The crisis in my relations with David occurred when I began to uncover evidence of his extramarital affairs. In doing so, I cannot claim any special skills as a detective. On the contrary, I learned about his mistresses almost at random. I was told about one at lunch one day by fellow guests. I learned about another late one night at a party. David's half-sister Charlotte told me about another mistress, an American photographer. When I contacted her, she was friendly and open and agreed to talk. But after she spoke to David, she completely changed her tune. "I want no part in your book," she wrote to me. I heard about another woman, an Italian journalist, from someone who knew David well. To him, to my friend who'd known him well, she spoke freely about her affair with David, but to me, she pretended that it had been a misunderstanding. As soon as one of David's ex-mistresses opened her mouth, so it seemed, David shut her up. I was not especially interested in David's personal life in itself, though I could scarcely ignore the fact that betrayal was a recurrent theme of his. It did occur to me that a man who lives a double life is a man under pressure. Did this pressure energize the work? The life of a writer, even of a best-selling writer, is not very exciting. At essence, you just sit alone in a room with a pen or a keyboard. Perhaps the drama of David's later years was hidden. Were sexual adventures a relief from the tedium of the writing life? Was the excitement of adultery with the risk of exposure a stimulus to creativity? Was it a substitute for spying? The tension between David and me increased as I learned more about him. I think our continuing relationship is an achievement in itself, he wrote to me in 2014 when the book was nearing completion. As it reached that stage, he became more and more agitated, and at one stage even suggested that he was contemplating suicide. I was seriously alarmed. I had come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. That said, from close quarters, I had come to recognize flaws in the man I'd admired so much from a distance. One characteristic of his that dismayed me was his tendency to badmouth the people around him, his agent, his publisher, even his own sons. And probably, I began to realize, me. I wondered if I might read the books in a different way after such prolonged exposure to the man who had written them. In my mind, I began to distinguish between John le Carré, a writer whom I had always admired, and David Cornwell, a complex, driven, unhappy man. By early 2014, the biography was almost complete. David arranged for Jane to meet me without him at their house in Hampstead. On the unwritten agenda was the topic of his infidelities. David greeted me at the door and ushered me into the living room where we had often conducted our interviews. Then Jane appeared, and David left the room, and a short while later I heard the front door slam. This was the first time that Jane and I had been alone together for more than a few moments. I felt awkward, and she seemed tense. Neither of us wanted to be having this talk. We began by discussing an earlier draft that I'd sent to David. Then, rather abruptly, the conversation moved on to the topic which I had been dreading and neither of us really wanted to discuss. She stammered out some lines which had evidently been rehearsed, which I dutifully copied into my notebook. Nobody can have all of David, she told me. There was no real discussion. I think that both of us were relieved to draw the session to an end. I mumbled my goodbyes and left. Negotiations continued through subsequent drafts, even after the book had been copy-edited. Belatedly, I remembered that David was in the habit of rewriting his books in proof, a privilege denied to ordinary authors. On the 1st of May 2015, when the book was already in proof, Jane sent me by email a typed 22-page memorandum containing 196 numbered points of items that David wished to contest. I was able to deal with most of these straightforwardly enough, though it was unusual to be contemplating changes at this late stage and introduce the possibility of error as a result. Sometimes the discussion was circular. On at least one occasion, for example, I was able to demonstrate to him that a source that he had questioned was himself. He seemed disgruntled, a tone that I found reflected in private letters to others that I did not see until they were published in volume form towards the end of 2002, after David's death. As for me, I felt worn down by the seemingly unending whittling away at what I'd written, and by this time my overriding motive was simply to get to the end of the process one way or another. After such a bruising experience, I was pleasantly surprised to receive a friendly letter from David on the day my book was published in October 2015. "I'm sure you're having a great time, so enjoy it," he wrote, with only a slight edge. "What's done is done." In the same week, it was announced that he was writing a memoir, which some have since interpreted as an act of sabotage or even of betrayal of our original agreement. In due course, he sent me an advance copy of the memoir inscribed on the title page. I wrote a piece about it in The Guardian. I never saw him again after that. Our last contact came almost 4 years later when I sent him a pre-publication proof of another book I'd written about a con man who in some ways resembled his father, Ronnie. David seems to have enjoyed what I had written and sent me a nice letter about it. 18 months later, he was dead. I did have one final encounter with him when in some Soho screening rooms, I watched a rough cut of a film based on his memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel. In a further twist, I'd been hired as a consultant. There on the screen was David again, smiling and laughing, weaving his spell once more as he told a succession of stories, some of which I knew to be untrue, or at least partially so. Try as I might, I couldn't suppress a feeling of affection for the old magician.
Adam, thank you so much. That was fascinating. What a great way to begin the show this evening. Our second speaker tonight is Rosamund Young, who runs Kite's Nests Farm on the edge of the Cotswold Escarpment. Rosamund is the best-selling author of The Secret Life of Cows, which was named a Times Book of the Year, and the recently published The Wisdom of Sheep and Other Animals, which she'll be speaking about this evening. Rosamund, welcome.
Hello. Just trying to turn myself on.
There we go.
I want to talk about death and dating sites, neither of which I've got first-hand experience of, fortunately, and sheep. Death because my brother recently died, which was a huge shock, which I can't pretend hasn't affected me. It seems to take my memory away at unexpected moments. We'd been a good brother-sister partnership for 70 years and a great farming partnership for over 50. Dating sites, because I was lucky enough to find my ideal life and farming partner when I was 58 and past it and no longer looking. And it made me think that had I ever joined a dating site, I would never have put in a box asking me for ideal qualities in a mate the words short, bald, Welsh, or cabinet maker. But it did make me remember that no people know what they want, most especially those who think they do, but all animals know what they want. Unfortunately, what they want is what they need, and what they need is what they want. So in theory, it makes a farmer's life easy. I can't say it's easy keeping sheep, but it is easy feeding them as long as you let them have freedom to choose. I'm passionate about giving all my animals freedom because they can self-medicate, and basically what ruminants need is grass, and they are able to convert cellulose into something that humans can consume, whereas we can't eat grass. And a huge proportion of Great Britain's cover grass and too steep to grow crops other than grass. But sometimes my passion for freedom backfires, fortunately only on me, not on them. And in winter especially, when the nutritional quality of grass is very poor, my sheep will seek blackberry leaves. And blackberries have thorns, and the sheep become impaled on the thorns, not unlike the washing on the bushes that we're told about in Dylan Thomas's Under Milk Wood. My sheep become impaled on the thorns, And so I have the task of snipping them free, which is always painful, often time consuming, and sometimes very difficult. But some farmers eradicate the blackberry bushes. Some trim their bushes so neatly that the sheep don't get any chance to nibble them, and they don't get much shelter or shade either. And some farmers keep their sheep inside, which when I first heard this alarmed me enormously. I tried keeping my sheep in just once when they were lambing when I was a real novice shepherdess, and they absolutely folded their arms and sat on their bottoms and refused to lamb until I let them out. So that taught me a lesson. But I am ashamed to admit that for many, many years, I thought sheep were inferior to cattle. And by implication, shepherds were inferior to cattle keepers. I saw hundreds of sheep roaming around, apparently aimlessly in fields. And of course, I didn't know any of them individually until one day we were given 2 orphan lambs to rear, and I could immediately see their individual personalities. One writer, whose name I can't remember at the moment, who studied blue tits for many, many years, opening her cottage windows wide and allowing them to come in and out at will, complained that people often criticized her for giving them human characteristics. But as she countered, these people don't realize that such characteristics are not just human. So I found myself very soon in a world full of sheep, but more importantly, in a world where I could observe without the prejudices that had previously dogged me. This coincided with me taking on full responsibility for my mother's health. She was suffering from something which no doctor could identify, and basically her pain either bored or baffled every single doctor she turned to for help. So it took many crises and 3 very close shaves with death before I had to embrace the fact that food is everything. If I could produce or source perfect food for her and for my animals, they could all have pretty happy lives. But food has such enormous power to make people ill, as well as, fortunately, with the power to make them well if they find out what they need. But edible substances masquerading as food, which is another way of saying highly processed food, is causing ill health, and people aren't even aware of it. Quite often, if you see something that looks nice, or even you try it and it tastes nice, that seems to me an appallingly bad reason for eating it. If something tastes horrible, or you don't like it, or you don't want to eat it, that's a very good reason. But the tempting substances that are on offer can actually and are actually causing tremendous problems. If you're well, if you feel healthy, which is exactly the same as saying if you eat the correct food, you're going to enjoy life and you're going to treat your fellow creatures, everything, people and animals, properly. I would actually dare to say that every human problem has its roots in health, which is the same as food. Domestic violence, depression, attention deficiency, poor sleep, absolutely everything. For 40 years, I looked after my mother, and during that time, I met many other people who've had allergies or intolerances or all sorts of things. And sometimes they had a diagnosis and had to struggle. And so many of them didn't even consider thinking that their problems could be caused sometimes the food they weren't eating. keeping animals and bestowing endless love on them in the form of attention and anticipation of their needs. For years. And other than by hunting. And he showed me many how they of hunting just what they needed to keep alive, hunting for survival, and an acutely non-greedy attitude and a respect for their prey. So the answer to me simply has to be to treat all animals properly, give them the best possible life and the best possible death, because we can't outthink our own history. This same book, The Meat Paradox, reminded me or taught me that our ancestors, living in trees mainly eating fruit, nuts, had at some point in history no choice but to come down and scamper across the plains and scavenge and start eating meat. Climatic conditions had destroyed so many of the trees, there was simply no alternative. And the upshot of that was that human brains became bigger. In tandem with this, I learned something that had always mystified me, which is why human babies are born so useless, or at least so unable to have any independence, even hold up their own heads in most instances. And he explained to me that eating meat made our brains grow bigger. And one could easily argue that that's where the problem lies. If we didn't have these big brains and think ourselves so intelligent, we wouldn't perhaps have been able to invent all the non-biodegradable things that are destroying the world so quickly. But either way, humans did eat meat. Babies' brains became bigger and they could no longer be born successfully without killing the mother at what was probably an 18-month gestation period, at which point they would have been able to be somewhat independent, maybe hold up their heads, maybe even move on their own. So they started to be born more around 9 months and were needing to be cosseted and looked after and carried everywhere for at least another 9 months before they had any independence. These first 2 orphan lambs that we were given, we called Audrey and Sybil. They were complete opposites. Sybil fell in the swimming pool one day, and Audrey, still a very young lamb herself, scampered down the bank, leapt a stream, and came up to the back door where she knew, or at least hoped I would be, and banged on the door with her little foot and screamed her head off until I opened the door. And then she made me follow her by racing away, rather like Lassie, the dog, and running back towards me and then racing away again, enabling me to save her stupid friend who'd fallen in the swimming pool, though I had to jump in freezing cold water to do so. 38 years later, another orphan lamb called Dandelion screamed bookingly. She was about 150 yards away, and it forced me to rush down to her side. But she was unable to show me what was wrong. Her son, I could see, wasn't there, and eventually I found him. It took me 10 minutes. He was wrapped up in wire netting, and that could have been a fatal delay. I suppose she thought that as I was a meat-eating human with a big brain, I would know why she was screaming, but I didn't. But I did find him in time. She did her best. Audrey did better. I wouldn't like to dare say, and I certainly couldn't prove, that Audrey in 1985 had a better diet, but I wouldn't be surprised. The so-called green revolution, which in fact was anything but green, when farmers started to use every single chemical and artificial fertilizer at their disposal to increase yields, which had the result of the nutritional quality as they grew, so that today, there's no doubt every apple you eat and everything else has got far less nutritional value than it used to have. So the answer has to be to accept that we are that creature that started to eat meat. It's unfortunate, and obviously I realize that anyone can individually decide to be a vegan, and I thoroughly approve, and I have many friends who do. But it's not an option for a large number of people. It's an individual choice. You have to be intelligent enough to find all the things you need to have a balanced diet, which is so much easier if you have meat in your diet. But as there are so many millions of people, and so many of them with no access to food other than meat, we have to make sure that animals are kept properly, given a good life and a good death, because food really is the same as health, and without health none of us have anything.
Rosamund, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and I'm very sorry to hear of your loss.
Thank you.
Our next speaker this evening is Paul Caruana Galizia, reporter after his mother Daphne was assassinated. Since then, he's won numerous awards for his work, including a British Journalism Award, as well as a Magnitsky Human Rights Award with his two brothers. His new book, A Death in Malta, is an account of his search for justice. Paul, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you everyone who is listening to this and watching it. So there is some connection to Rosamund's story in that this one, I'm afraid, is also about death and starts with a relative's death. It starts, in fact, on the 16th of October 2017, when a bomb placed under my mother's car seat was detonated by 3 men in Malta. So I know the exact time that the bomb went off, 2:58 p.m. It was a Monday afternoon. And I know the exact SMS that was used to trigger the bomb. So #REL1 equals on. So I know these details because for the past 6 years, my 2 older brothers and I have been campaigning for justice for my mother. So we've been in and out of court across 3 criminal proceedings, countless constitutional cases, and the country's first public inquiry. I know more details, and I know them by now like the back of my hand, also because I've spent the past 3 of those 6 years writing a book about my mother. So the one Jack mentioned, it's called A Death in Malta, but it turned out to be about a lot more than my mother's assassination. And over the writing, I realized it should be more than that. And it's really a book about the fullness of her life and the three boys she brought up. And it's also about this tragic arc of her life that I realized over the writing maps in a really eerie way onto the arc of our country's history, which I see as quite tragic. And it's also about the campaign I mentioned that my brothers and I have been on ever since 2017, and how ultimately the goal of that campaign is to sort of bend that arc to a very different place. So my mother was born in 1964, so just 2 weeks before Malta became independent from Britain. And for the first few years of her life in the 60s, it looked like the country would fulfill those promises it made itself around independence, that it would be free and affluent and successful and, in a word, independent. But then in the early 70s, as was the fashion around the world in newly formed states, the country turned inward. So it elected a very socialist government that began closing off the economy in order to grow domestic industry, began restricting foreign travel, and turning away from the West and towards the Soviet Union, China, Libya. And my mother's world, just as she was growing up in the 70s, began closing in. And she began feeling quite isolated and disaffected. So, you know, I remember my mother telling us, "You don't know how lucky you are. You boys, when I grew up, there was only one brand of chocolate available, one type of toothpaste, one type of casual shoe, which would all have to dye different colors." But the outside world, or the West, really became available to my mother through these foreign magazines my maternal grandparents used to subscribe to. And I say in the book, my maternal grandmother, who was still alive when I was writing it, told me, you know, we used to subscribe to everything, The Spectator, Newsweek, and Punch. And I thought, you know, it's not really everything, but it brought to my mother this view of a really different way of living. You know, all those kind of principles of capitalism, freedom, and those ideas seem to have taken root. And she also began thinking more broadly about writing, that she began asking why the writing in those publications was so different to what she read around her in Malta, which was much more conservative, always anonymous, and never very challenging. And over time, that love of reading gave way to one of writing, but not before she met my father, quite young, and had us 3 boys, again quite young. So by the time she was 24, she had all of us. But then began, as you might imagine, feeling quite bored and fed up at home. So began writing part-time for a magazine. And I always remember being with her as a boy. And my father worked as a lawyer and was out of the house quite a lot. And in fact, I remember them coming home, you know, in a row. And apparently my father had said something like, the good thing about having had 3 boys in quick succession is that they brought themselves up. And of course it wasn't the case at all. We were always with my mother. So she began writing for the newspapers really in the late 80s, but she got her column in 1990 on the Sunday Times of Malta. So she was the first woman to write a column, and also the first columnist to write under their own byline. So everyone else in the country wrote anonymously, even up to 1990, out of fear of violent reprisals or any other kind of reprisal, really. So very quickly, the journalism came home. So in 93, 94, she was reporting on a drug trafficker whose father was the brigadier. And the suspicion was always that it was the brigadier who'd help his son bring drugs into the country. Anyway, that was her first big story, I suppose. And we of course didn't know it at the time. I was about 6 or 7. But I remember at a point my mother bringing us home from school, and we found one of our dogs lying dead across the doorstep in a pool of her own blood. So she was a border collie we call Messalina. And my mother telling us, don't worry about Messalina, she ate snail poison, which had happened with a Labrador we had. It was only until much later, in fact, when I was about 16, that my father told me, no, someone slit her throat. And this was a few weeks after that our front door, our wooden front door, went up in flames. And I remember it perfectly. And I also remember my mother telling us, don't worry about it. I just drop a lit candle against the front door. And again, my brothers and I grew up seeing all these things because we were always with her, either driving around or at home. And in large part, because of the book, I had to revisit all of these memories and weirdly developed an almost parallel childhood, in the sense that the original memories are still there, but now there's this other layer. And I, speaking to my father and my grandparents for the book, I realized just how much more of it there was that I don't even remember. So she used to take us to a more rural island. Sometimes in the middle of school, she'd just pull us out of school, take us on the ferry, and we'd spend a week, even in the middle of winter, on what's a kind of summer resort island. And then I realized those trips, what we thought were holidays, always coincided with a very difficult period of reporting for her. And it was only again much later that I look back on these little things, like the way she would approach her car in the morning before taking us to school, and that she was already then in the 90s nervous about a bomb being put underneath it. And then, of course, when I was older, like late teens, these things became directly obvious to me. When I was about 17, so around the time I was doing my A-levels, there was another arson attack on the house, this time a lot worse. So stacks of used car tires, bottles filled up with petrol put at the back of the house. And again, around the time she was reporting on quite a difficult subject, so Malta's first really far-right party, which had developed in response to asylum seekers looking to land in Malta. So this was around 2006, and Malta had just joined the EU 2 years earlier, so it became very attractive to people looking to claim asylum. And so this is what I meant earlier about the tragic arc. So joining the EU was always very important to my mother and to us. So my mother campaigned a lot for it because she saw it as the answer to Malta's problems, this silver bullet that would solve all these issues of governance, of human rights, that would bring Malta closer to that world she used to read about as a girl in foreign magazines. But in the end, or in retrospect, rather, something else happened, in that Malta did globalize and did become a lot richer, but remained with the same rickety institutions that we had really since 64. So when we decolonized, there was some constitutional reform, but not the kind that we would need to deal with huge inflows of money, really serious problems of corruption, and a very powerful executive. And for my mother, that meant that she went from reporting on very Maltese corruption, so the drug trafficker, what he was doing, other people trying to bribe Maltese police officers, Maltese judges. So she went from that to reporting on kickback schemes running into the billions of euros or dollars, you know, flows coming from post-Soviet states, from the Gulf. And it happened weirdly, imperceptibly, because the changes in Malta have been so fast. And this was, in fact, one of those stories that she was working on at the time of her death. So in 2016, through the Panama Papers leak, found that two very senior Maltese politicians, so the Minister for Energy and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, had set up two companies in Panama just a few days after they were elected to government in 2013. So she had these two companies through the leak. A few months later, she heard about another offshore company, one called 17 Black, but it didn't feature in the leak, and was in fact registered in the United Arab Emirates. And because it wasn't in the leak, she never had access to documentation on that company's owner. So for the last few months of her life, she worked very hard across a number of stories, but especially this, trying to find out who owned 17 Black. But of course, she never did. So she was murdered, again in October 2017. And quite soon after, in fact, immediately after that, because the government's response to her murder was so aggressive, my brothers and I were thrown into campaign mode. And one of the things we did was share a lot of her material with a group of journalists who went on to call themselves the Daphne Project. So journalists across the Guardian, New York Times, Reuters. And what they found almost exactly a year after that, is that the owner of that company, 17 Black, is a man who now stands charged with commissioning her murder. So the three men I mentioned at the start who detonated the bomb pleaded guilty at different points, but they've all pleaded guilty by now. A middleman received a pardon in exchange for evidence on the murder. And another three men are awaiting trial for supplying the bomb. So that's 8 men to kill my mother. But anyway, so I said at the start also that the book was about more than her murder. And it was held up for a long time, for months, in fact, because it took me a long time to appreciate. I had to report on my mother like I'd report on anyone else, as though I were writing a magazine profile or something. And I had to speak to her, her old school friends, my grandparents, my father, of course. But then someone put me in touch with her first love, which was, an incredibly moving conversation. And so moving. In a very early draft, I gave it a lot of space, a lot more than it needed anyway. And I shared that draft only with my father and my two brothers. And so my middle brother, Andrew, told me, it's good, but I'm going to email you a few suggested scenes. And, the next day I got an email with 10 suggested scenes, each one starring him. Matthew wouldn't read a draft for another 2 years. And my father told me, I liked it, Paul, but do we really need so much on the first boyfriend? And I thought at that point, the book started changing for me, and again became a lot more about her, and as I said, the fullness of her life. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful. It's a tribute to your mother's work, and we thank you for sharing that with us this evening. Our fourth speaker tonight is the writer Kassia St Clair, author of the top 10 bestseller, The Secret Lives of Colour, which was a Radio 4 Book of the Week and has been translated into over a dozen languages. Her new book, The Race to the Future, tells the incredible true story of a quest against the odds that shaped the world we live in today. Kassia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the people who've spoken so far for their amazing and really heartfelt stories. I am going to share my screen with you because I have slides, which I hope will work. Okay. Hang on a second. There we go. Hopefully that's working. So when I was thinking about what to speak about this evening, and how to sort of introduce people to my new book, The Race to the Future, there were several things that cropped up, but the idea that kept on surfacing was the idea of improbable journeys, not least because The Race to the Future has an incredibly improbable journey at its heart. So The Race to the Future stars a journey that was proposed by a Parisian newspaper called Le Matin, who in January 1907 announced on their front page that they wanted to challenge the automotive industry and drivers across the world to a challenge. They said that at the time, cars were primarily being driven by the super wealthy, and when they were being raced on circular tracks, and this was an insult to the new technology, to this incredible new technology. They said that if the automotive industry was to have any hope of flourishing, it needed to be put to a sterner test. And the test that they propose was a race from Peking, now Beijing, overland through the Russian Empire and to Paris. This is a challenging journey to contemplate even today, but in 1907, it really was the sternest challenge that the automobile had faced thus far. For the vast majority of this route, there would be no roads. There would be maybe tracks, particularly in Mongolia, in the Mongolian plains. The rivers changed each, with the seasons. Their courses weren't particularly set, and so there weren't, accurate maps that could be gotten hold of in Paris. So this was an enormous challenge, and not only were roads pretty few and far between for about the first 2/3 of the race, there were also no petrol stations. This was predominantly going to be a journey for petrol fuel cars. And fuel cars need fuel. So in order to get around this, they had to load up camels and donkeys and mules with petrol, and take the fuel to strategic locations in the Gobi Desert and through the Russian Empire, and leave them there for the drivers to find. As you can imagine, as this Parisian newspaper Le Matin started setting out this journey and how it might work logistically, there were just howls of derision from most of the world. Another newspaper compared the proposed Peking to Paris race as being akin to asking people to travel from Rangoon to the moon via telegraph wire. And people didn't think it would be possible. Part of the reason it was seen as so profound and even ridiculous a challenge was that 5 years before this race was proposed in 1902, a around the world journey had been begun. Dr. Lewis set off from London, intending to travel through Europe into the Russian Empire and onwards and all around the world. And he'd made it to Berlin in about 3 months, and then got stuck just past Moscow. The car that he was driving ran into a snowdrift and got stuck there, and that was the end of that. And this had been such a humiliating failure that it was referenced time and time again by people talking about the Peking to Paris. Nevertheless, 5 cars did turn up to the start line in June 1907 after not much planning, and off they went. And my book talks about their journey, how they made it or didn't, westwards to Paris. I suppose, spoiler alert, some of them did make it, but this was a highly improbable journey, and so I think that speaks for itself. Part of what made me want to talk about improbable journeys, and part of what made the Peking to Paris challenge improbable all on its own, was the automobile, which was still, in its very kind of in its adolescence in 1907. The technology for the car, I think I should go back a bit. I think now we tend to think of automobiles as being kind of like of cars as being like the apex predator, in a way, that they were, of course, the best method of transport, and so of course they won out over everything else. But in 1907, this really didn't seem to be the case. That over the past century, most countries have been concentrating on building railways, and were still, heavily reliant on animal power. In fact, animal power had increased. The need for animal power had increased with the railway, because suddenly you have all these goods that are coming into major transport hubs, and they need to go that last little distance. So all these train companies had vast stables in order to finish off that last little bit of transportation. And so this had a big impact on roads in a lot of places. So roads that had been essential for riders, messengers, carts to get from A to B are suddenly looking really old-fashioned. They're suddenly looking like, a relic of the past. And so particularly in places like, Russia, that were relatively well served by trains, the Trans-Siberian Railway had been opened. Roads had been allowed to fall into disrepair, and they were seen as sort of almost quite quaint. And the idea that a vehicle that absolutely required roads, and more than that, required really good roads, automobiles in 1907 were fairly fairly prone to mishap. All drivers' guides and magazines of the time recommended that if you were going on any sort of trip, that you take with you a vast quantity of spare parts and tools in order to fix the inevitable problems that would surface along the way. And that was on good roads. The thought that you would need to, that countries that had just invested huge amounts of money in building, railways and canals and other transport systems, would then have to go back and build competing systems of roads that would then have to be, painstakingly updated and made smooth enough for automobiles, really seemed, pretty ridiculous. And this is why you find in 1907 people very confidently predicting that automobiles, that they sort of will find their level as being akin to motorized racehorses, something of a diversion, something that doesn't really have a great deal of practical function unless it's for leisure. And this seems so strange to us today, and it would change. And the Peking to Paris race was part of what helped the car make this improbable journey from niche technology, something that the Economist wrote off as being, absolutely, something that was bound to fail, in contrast to the horse, and that prediction was made in 1907. The car suddenly then became, within a few short years, something that was considered pretty essential, and you get this huge reordering of cities to be built around the needs of the automobile and people who drive. The third improbable journey is the most personal one, and that's why I wanted to come to it last. And that is how I came to write this book. As you heard from the introduction, my previous books were on colour and textiles. I am not particularly mechanically minded. I don't know one end of the spanner from another. I'm ashamed to say I've never had to change a tire, and I've never done so. And so this seems like a very odd topic for me to cover, but I completely fell in love with it. It drew me in, and I had to write it. I found so many primary sources. I was able to track down the surviving family members of some of the original racers, who kindly shared with me their memories, photograph albums, and letters, which allowed me to uncover parts of the Peking to Paris story that had never been told before. I also had great ambitions to redo the journey with my husband, and we bought a Toyota Land Cruiser. That's the middle picture, which we nicknamed Barbara. We took delivery of her in January 2020. We then spent the next 2 years, like everyone else, very much trapped at home. I was tearing my hair out, but luckily had done an awful lot of the research that I needed to do, so was able to concentrate on writing the book, but thought, okay, next year I'll be able to do the journey. Okay, next year I started learning Russian in order to feel like I was progressing in some way. And then in the autumn of 2021, just after I handed in the first draft of the book, I found out I was pregnant. I thought, okay, well, yes, my child will be born within days of the anniversary of the start of the race, and that is the best time to do the journey because of the weather conditions. But maybe I can, babies are said to be very portable at that age. Maybe I can still do the journey. And then, of course, very sadly, war broke out, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, which has really meant that the journey is fundamentally postponed for the moment, although I would still love to do it one day. So although I haven't been able to do the journey and to see the landscapes for myself, I was able to get over myself, to realize that it wasn't about me, to return to the research, and to write this book, which I'm very proud of. I'm sure that avid motorheads will find all sorts of mistakes I've made, but I'm so pleased to tell the story of the race, and then also to draw out some of the themes that make this story so incredible. The development of the automobile, how horse-powered cities functioned in practice, and some of the incredible women who were right there at the very dawn of the motor age. So yes, I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I know that the format doesn't allow for questions, but if you do have any, please do get in touch. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Kassia, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And please do keep us posted when you go on the journey. Eventually, we want to hear all about it.
I will.
Our final speaker tonight is David Grann, a staff writer at The New Yorker and author of a number of international bestsellers, including Killers of the Flower Moon, which was recently adapted for the screen by none other than Martin Scorsese. David's highly acclaimed new book, The Wager, tells an incredible true story of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder. He's here tonight to tell us all about it. David, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. Thank you all for listening. And it was wonderful to listen to all those previous speakers as well. I want to talk to you a bit about my new book, The Wager, but in particular, I think for today, I want to talk about research and the search for the truth, and the way that research can shape a story and change a story, and how that research can also lead you to places that you would never expect. For example, one day, several years ago, while doing research on this project, I found myself on a small wood-heated boat off the Chilean coast of Patagonia, barreling through a gulf that is known as the Gulf of Pain. It was storming and the ship was rocking side to side. All I could see in front of us was this towering wave, and behind us, another towering wave. It was so, the ship was being tossed about so violently that I did not dare stand. I just hunkered down on the deck. If I did stand, I might break a limb. And in case you think I'm taking a little bit of liberty, an exaggeration with the truth, I have a video that I recorded while sitting there, which I can show you now. Now, as you're watching this and as you see the picture of me, you could probably tell I'm not much of an adventurer. And I had taken just about every possible remedy to stave off seasickness. I had one of those patches behind my ear, and I was dosed on so much Dramamine, I was in a stupor. Still, I felt increasingly nauseous as these objects continued to fly past me. There was a bill pump, a jacket, and we had not seen another boat or even another soul for days. And I kept glimpsing out the window, hoping to find or see that place that for so long had consumed my imagination, Wager Island. It was on that deserted island that had taken place one of the most extraordinary and gripping sagas of survival and mayhem, one that had influenced philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, scientists like Charles Darwin, two of the great novelists of the sea, Herman Melville and Patrick O'Brien. Yet as the boat rocked further and further over, and as the sea swallowed the deck, I began to wonder what perhaps you're wondering now, which is, how the hell did I end up in the Gulf of Pain? And the story begins, I suppose, as not too many ones do, back all the way in the 1740s. And it was then that a small little boat washed ashore off the coast of Brazil. On board, crammed inside, were 30 men, their bodies almost wasted to the bone. They were so weak, they could not even stand. But one of them announced that they were the survivors of His Majesty's ship, the Wager, and that after journeying after being stranded and shipwrecking on a desolate island, they had built this flimsy craft and journeyed some 3,000 miles, completing one of the longest castaway voyages ever recorded. And they were hailed for their ingenuity and their bravery. But then, not long after, another little boat washed ashore, this time on the other side of South America, off the Chilean side of Patagonia. This boat was even smaller. It was just a little wooden dugout. It had a sail that was stitched together from rags of blankets. And on board were just 3 people, including the captain of the Wager, who was so delirious he could not even recollect his name. But after they began to recover, they told a very, very different story. They said that those people who had preceded them and gone to Brazil were not actually heroes. They were mutineers. And in the controversy that followed, with these both sides lobbying these charges back and forth, it became clear that while stranded on that desolate island, they had slowly descended into a real-life Lord of the Flies with warring factions, murder, and mutiny. And back in England, the principal figures, along with their allies, were summoned to face this court-martial. And after waging this furious battle against the elements, they suddenly have to wage a war over the truth, because they are being accused of committing these crimes on the island. And if they don't tell a convincing tale after everything they've been through, they could be hanged. And so to tell this story presented all sorts of challenges. First of all, you have a war over the truth. And so I began to look through records, and many of them had written diaries, they had written journals. Incredibly, these logbooks had survived the expedition. But I was confounded by how am I going to tell this story? You know, there's always this illusion that the historian is somehow omniscient, you know, godlike, that they could kind of see into every nook and cranny and sort out the truth. But in this case, I was confronted with all these records. And yet each person is shaping their own story, manipulating their story, burnishing certain facts and leaving out other facts. They're no longer alive. I can't interrogate them. And I'm kind of stuck with the records I have. So the first quandary and challenge I found was, how am I going to tell this story? And it occurred to me that the best way to tell it would be through the competing perspective of three people on board the wager. And why did I do that? Again, because I thought it would show the way each of them were shaping their stories, but also the way we all shape our stories, trying to emerge as the hero of them. And I chose to tell the book based on the underlying records from the perspective of three people. One was the captain, David Cheap. He was somebody, he was Scottish. He was somebody who on land was always kind of embittered and frustrated and plagued and chased by creditors and in debt. But on a ship, he had always found refuge. And on this expedition, he had, when they first set out from England shortly after, achieved what he had always longed for, which was a chance to captain his own ship. He was promoted to captain. The other perspective I told it from was that of the gunner, John Bulkeley, on the wager. And Bulkeley was an interesting figure because he was in many ways the most skilled seaman on the ship. But because he did not come from the aristocracy, he knew that he could never become a captain. And then the third perspective was told from that of John Byron, who had been a 16-year-old midshipman on the wager when they set sail. And if his name is familiar, it's because he would later go on to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. And Lord Byron's poetry was greatly influenced by John Byron's journal, by what he referred to as my granddad's narrative. And so that is the way I began to structure the story. And of course, it follows their voyage as they set out. And almost everything goes wrong for them on the ship. And these ships were like little floating civilizations with people from all walks of life. And first, they have to battle scurvy. Then they go around Cape Horn, where they face some of the most violent seas in the world, where the waves can tower over a 90-foot wave. And as you read the records, you're always kind of looking for that anecdote, that gem that can hopefully illuminate it. And one of the anecdotes I found in one of the logbooks described how during the storm, they couldn't even fly their sails because it was so rough and they would blow out. So the captain had ordered his men to climb the mast and to use their bodies as threadbare sails, holding on while the ship rocked 45 degrees from one side and then to the other. And then eventually the wager will wreck on a desolate island off the coast of Chile. It will break apart. And about 145 of the surviving members, including the captain, David Cheap, Bulkeley, the gunner, and the midshipman, John Byron, become marooned on this island. And initially, they kind of struggle to build an outpost, but fairly rapidly, they begin to descend into chaos and into these warring factions. There is even a class struggle on the island because suddenly, amid that democracy of suffering, somebody like John Bulkeley, who could never have been the captain of a ship, begins to emerge as a commander. And one of the things that interested me was, even when they are on the island, they're having these philosophical debates about the nature of leadership, about the nature of society. who should be their commander. Are you your commander because that was your title and because you were born into it? Or again, could someone like John Buckley emerge? And they begin to keep documents and petitions, because even when they're on the island, they are trying to shape their story, because they know if they ever get back to England, they will face a court-martial for the things they may have done on the island. And so even then, they are trying to build this unassailable story to justify their actions. And incredibly, some of them would make it back to England, and they get summoned to face this court-martial. And for me, what was so interesting in the research and trying to find the themes, because that's partly, you don't really know what a book is about when you begin it. You know, I knew it would follow this voyage, this kind of maritime saga of survival and disaster. But as I was going to the archives and reading these records, I was struck by how they were having this war over the truth. And then I was coming home, and I was reading our newspaper here in the United States, in New York, where I am now. And I was reading about our own wars over the truth, about so-called fake news and alternative facts. And then I would go back to the archives, and I'd be reading these 18th century journals that were crumbling and dusty. And I would see how they were having a war over history and who would get to tell the story. And then I would come home, and we'd be having the same wars over history and who gets to tell it in our own contemporary times. So I began to find in this strange little story from the 18th century really a parable for our own turbulent times. Now, as I began and spent the first couple of years of my research, I did it only in archives, a place more suited to my very paltry physical attributes. You could probably see some of the records in the camera behind me. But over time, I began to wonder, could I ever fully understand what those castaways had gone through unless I made a journey to the island myself? And so even though this isn't in the book, I wanted to just tell you quickly a little bit about that journey, because it would shape my research and it would shape my understanding of what happened. So I found a Chilean captain who had a boat to take me there. And initially, he had sent me a photograph of the boat, and it looked really big. But when I got there, as you can see here, the boat was really tiny. I thought it was going to be the Jacques Cousteau vessel, but it turned out to be extremely tiny. And eventually we set off. And at first, we just kind of followed the journey. We're heading from Chiloé Island, which is about 350 miles north of Wager Island, what is now known as Wager Island. Initially, we kind of followed the journey through these channels, kind of protected from the sea. But after about 5 days, the captain said to me, well, now we're going to have to go out into the ocean if we're going to get to Wager Island. And suddenly we headed out into the unprotected Pacific. And I got my first glimpse of these terrifying seas. And as you recall from the video I had showed you, it was so rough, I just sat there. Now, I'm not the wisest person. I had to figure out a way to pass the time. I didn't know what to do. So as I was just sitting there for about 10 or 12 hours a day, holding on, I had an audio recording of Moby Dick, and so I listened to it. An unbelievable novel, but I do not recommend listening to it in really rough seas. And eventually we head into the Gulf of Pain, and we do make it to Wager Island. And here you can see me standing on the island, all kind of wearing all my warm clothing. And as you can see, I'm so bundled up, and it helped give me a better understanding of how cold the castaways were when they were there. They had only bits of clothing that gradually disintegrated. And this island, I needed to understand it, and it remains completely windswept, desolate, barren. It rains almost all the time, or sleet, and there is virtually no food on the island. I found here, and you can see in this picture, some celery, which some of the castaways had found, which did actually cure some of their scurvy, but that was about all they could find. And I began to finally, after exploring that island and having the journals with me, it finally really helped me understand why a British captain had described this island as a place where the soul of man dies into him. And so again, even though I never described my journey at all in the book, it was that kind of research, that kind of tactile research and experience that helps inform and breathe life so much into the descriptions. And at one point when we were on the island, one of the people with us out, she was the captain, there was a little stream near the where the castaways had built their encampment. He says, look over here, look over here. And we looked into the water, and there, just beneath the surface of the water, we could see some wood. And this was timber. They were about 5 yards long. They were bound together with tree nails, like wooden pegs. And they are from the remnants of an 18th century warship, believed to be from His Majesty's ship, the Wager. We knew what they were because an expedition had discovered them about a decade earlier. And as I stood there, I just kept staring at this little fragment, this little remnant of the ship, because after all those furious warring stories, after all the elements, this was all that remained. And the only sound I could hear was that eternal hush of the sea. Thank you all so much. It was such a pleasure to chat with you.
David, what a gripping way to end this evening, and you've given us so much to reflect on about storytelling itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our brilliant speakers this evening, to Adam, Rosamund, Paul, Kassia, and David. Remember that you can order all of their books from Newham Bookshop, and if you missed any of the titles, they're being posted in the chat right about now, and we'll be sending details out to you tomorrow as well. Next week, don't miss Regeneration, the second event in 5x15's new series with Kew Gardens and Rathbones, with a brilliant panel who'll be speaking about young people and the environment. You can find all the details for that on our website, www.5x15.com. A huge thank you again to all of our speakers, and good night.